There is a story etched into the earth of southeastern Australia. A story written not in ink, but in stone and water. From high above, the landscape reveals a strange and ancient tapestry, a vast, intricate network of channels, weirs, and dams that stretches for miles across a volcanic plain. These are not the random scars of geology. They are deliberate. They are intelligent. They are the silent testament to a monumental feat of engineering. For more than 6,500 years this system operated. It channeled water, managed floods, and harvested life. It is one of the oldest and most extensive aquaculture systems on the entire planet. Older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Older than the stones of Stonehenge. This was a sophisticated food factory, a hydraulic machine built to sustain a people, allowing them to build permanent homes, to thrive in one place for generation after generation after generation. And this is just one chapter of the story. Early European explorers in their journals wrote of landscapes that defied their expectations. They described seeing massive fields of native grains stretching to the horizon, harvested and stacked in sheaves, ready to be ground into flour. They saw grasslands that looked less like wild nature and more like a carefully managed English park. They saw a continent that was not wild, but cultivated. Now consider the people who built this world. The first peoples of Australia, a culture traditionally defined by what it lacked in the eyes of the outside world. This was a people of the Stone Age. They had no metal to forge tools, no wheel to move earth, no beasts of burden to pull a plow or carry stone. They left behind no written blueprints, no grand monuments of kings and conquests that we so readily recognize as the markers of a great civilization. The story we have all been told is one of a simple, nomadic people, a culture of hunter-gatherers wandering a vast, untamed wilderness, a people who lived in the landscape but never truly shaped it. They were survivors, yes, but they were not builders, not engineers, not farmers. And yet, the stones of Budge Bim disagree. The ghost-like contours of ancient grain fields disagree. The very land itself tells a different, far more complex story. It speaks of a people who did not just survive in their environment, but actively managed it on an epic scale. They didn't just find food, they produced it. This was not an untamed wilderness. It was a garden, an engineered estate, a continent-sized farm sustained by the oldest continuous culture on Earth. This presents us with a profound paradox, a lie perhaps that we have told ourselves for centuries. So the question is not just what this is. To understand their solution, we must first understand the world they inhabited. But to truly grasp the scale of their challenge, we must first look at our own. Consider this. Our modern life is built upon a foundation of absolute certainty. We are certain that when we turn a tap, water will flow. We are certain that when we go to a store, the shelves will be filled with food, regardless of the season or the weather outside. Our survival is underwritten by a vast global industrial machine that has all but severed our connection to the immediate world around us. We have built a buffer between ourselves and the raw, unpredictable forces of nature. For us, a drought is an unfortunate headline, a notice to conserve water. Famine is a distant tragedy, something that happens elsewhere. Now, erase all of it. Erase the supermarkets, the pipelines, the global shipping lanes. Erase the certainty. Welcome to ancient Australia, a continent defined by a geological sleepiness, a land of profound and brutal extremes. This is the oldest, flattest, and driest inhabited continent on Earth. Its soils, unlike the young, fertile volcanic soils of the Fertile Crescent or the Andes, are ancient, weathered and leached of nutrients over hundreds of millions of years. They are among the most phosphorus-poor soils on the planet, making agriculture, as the rest of the world would come to know it, almost impossible. But the soil was only half the challenge. The true tyrant of this land was, and is, the sky. The climate of Australia does not operate on gentle, predictable cycles. It is a land of boom and bust, governed by the chaotic whims of weather patterns born thousands of miles away in the Pacific Ocean. It is a climate of savage dualities. The bust could last for a decade or more, a period of relentless, soul-crushing drought. The sun would bake the earth into a ceramic hard crust. Rivers would shrink into disconnected, stagnant pools, then vanish entirely, leaving behind ghostly white beds of salt. The great inland lakes would become plains of dust. Life would retreat, plants would wither, and the great herds of kangaroos and emus, the foundation of the hunt, would migrate away in search of water or simply perish. For the people living here, this wasn't an inconvenience. It was a slow, creeping existential threat. Every single day was a negotiation for survival, a search for the last remaining pockets of life in a dying world. Then, just when all hope seemed lost, the boom would arrive. The rains would come, not as gentle showers, but as biblical deluges. The parched rivers would transform overnight into raging torrents, ripping through the landscape, carving new paths. The desert would explode into a riot of green and color, a fleeting paradise. Water was everywhere. Life was abundant. For a brief moment, the land was a place of unimaginable plenty. This was the terrifying paradox they faced, a world that swung violently between starvation and superabundance. Inaction was not an option. Merely surviving the drought only to be potentially displaced by a flood was no way to build a future. To simply follow the old patterns of hunting and gathering in such a volatile world was to gamble with extinction at every turn. The people who faced this challenge had lived on this continent for over 65,000 years. They had endured the last ice age. Their oral histories, their sacred stories of the dreaming, were a deep, multi-millennial record of these climatic wars. They knew this land not as an enemy, but as a powerful, temperamental partner. They understood its rhythms, its secrets, its immense power to both give and take away. They knew that to secure a future, they couldn't just react to the world. They would have to anticipate it. They had to find a way to tame the flood, to capture its life-giving force and hold on to it for the inevitable, desperate thirst of the drought that was always coming. They were forced to attempt something radical, not for convenience, but for their very soul. They had to build a machine to trap time itself. To truly understand the genius of their solution, we have to look past the simple problem of not enough water. The challenge they faced was far more complex, and their perception of it was infinitely more sophisticated. For the Gunditj Mara people of Buj Bim, the obstacle wasn't a dead, indifferent landscape. The central character in their story was the land itself, and the sacred, life-giving water that pulsed through it. This water had a name, a spirit, and a physical embodiment: the kuyang, the short-finned eel. The kuyang was not just a source of food. It was a traveler on an epic, mysterious journey. Each year, these creatures would migrate thousands of kilometers from the freshwater systems of Victoria out into the deep ocean trenches of the Coral Sea to breed, and then, impossibly, their young would find their way all the way back to the very same streams their parents had left. This predictable, miraculous cycle was the heartbeat of the land. The true challenge, then, was not merely to survive the landscape, but to enter into a partnership with this powerful, sacred cycle. To do this, they first had to understand their world and their place within it. Their worldview was not one of humanity versus nature. It was framed by a concept we translate as the dreaming. But the dreaming is not a collection of myths about a forgotten past. It is an eternal, ever-present reality, a framework that weaves together people, animals, the land, the law, and the spiritual world into a single, interconnected whole. In this worldview, the landscape itself was created by the actions of powerful ancestral beings in the deep past. For the Gunditj Mara, The creator of their specific world was the great volcano, Bim. When it erupted over 30,000 years ago, it wasn't a random geological event. It was the ancestor shaping the country. The rivers of molten lava that flowed across the plains were not scars of destruction. They were a deliberate legacy. The hardened channel-like ridges and hollows they left behind were not a wasteland. They were a blueprint, a divine map left for them to read and to complete. The problem, therefore, was transformed. It was no longer, how do we conquer this impossible terrain? It became, how do we listen to this terrain and help it fulfill the purpose the ancestor intended? With this perspective, their reading tools were not instruments of cold measurement, but of deep ecological listening. They possessed a library of knowledge accumulated over 2,000 generations. They had no need for written calendars. Their calendar was the land itself. They divided the year into 6 or more distinct seasons, each defined by observable events in nature. The flowering of the wattle trees, the changing position of the stars we call Orion in the night sky, the arrival of migratory birds, these were the markers. They knew that when the yellow box trees flowered, the kuyang were fat and at their prime. This was their nilometer, their star chart, a living, breathing system of information. They read the land with a geological and hydrological literacy that is almost lost to us today. They understood the subtle slopes of the terrain, knowing precisely where to build a wall of stones to guide the water into a natural depression. They could see the hidden plumbing of the lava flows, recognizing which paths the water would take in a flood. They were masters of observation, reading the behavior of animals, the health of the plants, and the taste of the water to understand the state of their world. This was not a mystical guesswork. It was a science, refined and tested over a span of time that is difficult for the modern mind to even comprehend. This brings us to a critical question. Today, our modern society has access to an almost infinite amount of data. We have satellites that map every inch of the globe, sensors that measure the moisture in the soil, and supercomputers that model complex climate systems. But in gaining all this information, have we lost the wisdom to see the deep, interconnected patterns the Gunditjmara saw with their naked eyes? Is our data-rich but perhaps wisdom-poor approach to managing our planet truly sustainable? Let us know what you think in the comments below. The challenge they faced in the end was not one of scarcity but of understanding. They saw not a broken world that needed to be fixed, but a sacred system that invited their participation. They were not just surviving, they were fulfilling a spiritual contract, written into the very fabric of their country. And to fulfill that contract, they would need tools, not just of the hand, but of the mind and the community. So, with this profound understanding of their world, how did they physically impose their will upon it? How did they move the earth and redirect the water? The term often used to describe their material culture is the Stone Age. It's a label that, to the modern ear, sounds primitive, a shorthand for limitation. But this is a profound misunderstanding. It was not an age of limitation, it was an age of extraordinary mastery. Their genius was not in inventing complex materials, but in achieving complex results with the simple, powerful materials provided by the land itself. Their toolkit was born of the earth. The primary building block was the very stone they stood upon, the heavy, dense volcanic basalt. They became experts in its properties, using larger, heavier stones as mauls to break apart sheets of rock, shaping the raw material of the landscape into the walls of their channels and weirs. To fell the ancient hardwood trees for levers or shelters, they developed the stone axe. But without metal, felling a giant eucalyptus was a monumental task. They solved it with ingenuity, using the axe to ring bark the tree, cutting through the sapwood, and then often using fire at the base to finish the job. Fire for them was not just for warmth. It was a primary tool for shaping their world. The most humble, yet perhaps most powerful tool was the digging stick. It seems simple, a length of hardwood sharpened to a point and hardened in the embers of a fire. But in the hands of the women who were the primary agriculturalists, this tool transformed the landscape. It was the plow that tilled the soil for the fields of Murnong yams. It was the spade that cleared silt from the water channels. It was the crowbar that helped dislodge smaller rocks. Paired with wooden bowls known as coolamans used to carry away earth, this simple combination became a powerful earth-moving technology, scaled up by the power of the community. And in the water, the critical piece of technology was woven from reeds and grasses. The eel traps and baskets were masterpieces of textile engineering. They were designed with a precise understanding of hydrodynamics and animal behavior, with conical shapes that allowed eels to enter easily, but made it impossible for them to escape. This intricate knowledge of weaving, of choosing the right fibers and tying the right knots was as vital to their success as any stone tool. It was the soft, flexible heart of their hard rock machine. But the most sophisticated tools in their arsenal were not made of stone or wood. They were invisible. They were technologies of the mind and of the society. The bedrock of their ability to organize was their kinship system. This was a complex social scaffolding that defined every individual's roles, responsibilities, and relationships. It determined who you could marry, who you were obligated to help, and who you would share resources with. It was this intricate social structure that allowed them to mobilize large groups of people for communal projects, like building a new weir or conducting a mass harvest, without the need for a pharaoh, a king, or a class of slave drivers. Their work was driven by mutual obligation and a shared spiritual purpose. And the blueprint for their work? It wasn't written on paper. It was stored in the collective memory of the people, encoded in what we call song lines. To perform the ceremony was to read the blueprint aloud, to teach the next generation, and to ensure the knowledge was never lost. The architects and chief engineers of this entire enterprise were the elders. They were the living libraries, their minds holding the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. They were the ones who observed the subtle changes in the environment, who directed the timing of the harvests, and who presided over the ceremonies that passed the knowledge on. Within the community, specific families or individuals were the custodians of specific knowledge, the keepers of the eel lore, the masters of the grain harvest. Their authority came not from wealth or force, but from the depth of their knowledge and the weight of their responsibility to keep the system and their people alive. This, then, was their genius, the seamless integration of a simple physical toolkit with a highly complex and resilient social technology. They proved that with deep knowledge and a society built on cooperation and shared purpose, you don't need metal to move mountains. You just need the right people with the right story to guide them. The tools were simple. The social structure was complex. The knowledge was profound. Now we witness how these elements came together on the ground, in the water, and in the stone, to operate one of the great machines of the ancient world. It begins not with a shovel, but with an act of seeing. The Gunditch Mara people, guided by their elders, looked upon the chaotic, rocky aftermath of the Buj Bim volcano and saw not an obstacle, but a foundation. They saw the subtle lines of least resistance, the natural channels and depressions left behind by the cooling lava. This was the blueprint, and their work was to enhance it, to complete it. The construction was a slow, deliberate process, likely unfolding over countless generations. They began to build. Low walls, rarely more than a meter high, were erected by hand. They were not building impermeable dams to stop the water, but porous, intelligent barriers to guide it. Think of it as a form of hydraulic acupuncture, placing stones at key pressure points in the landscape to alter the flow of its energy. These would become the reservoirs, the beating heart of their machine. With every stone placed, the system grew more complex, more efficient. It was a monumental undertaking, yet it was done with a gentle hand, working with the contours of the land, not against them. Then they waited for the sky to turn. When the winter rains finally arrived, the machine would come alive. The land would take a great slow breath. The stone veins, dry for months, would fill with the lifeblood of water. What was once a hard gray landscape of rock transformed into a shimmering temporary wetland, a mosaic of ponds, channels, and marshes, teeming with life. The genius of the system was this act of slowing time. It captured the fleeting abundance of the wet season and held it captive, creating a vast, rich habitat that would endure long after the rains had stopped. As the waters swelled and the season turned, the second act began. The kuyang, the eels driven by an instinct thousands of years old, began their great migration towards the sea. But now, their ancient path was intercepted. As they swam with the current, they were guided by the stone walls, funneled inevitably towards the traps. Here, the Gunditjmara placed their masterfully woven baskets into specially designed openings in the weirs. The eels, following the path of least resistance, swam directly into them. It was not a hunt. There were no spears, no frantic chases. It was a calm, patient, and devastatingly efficient harvest, a perfect synthesis of natural instinct and human ingenuity. The bounty could be staggering, providing a reliable source of high-protein food for the entire community. But the system's brilliance did not end with the catch. This was not just about a single meal. It was about breaking the cycle of boom and bust forever. The harvested eels were taken to the permanent camps, often situated on the higher ground overlooking the wetlands. Here, using the hollows of ancient manna gum trees as natural smokehouses, they preserved their catch. The smoked eels could be stored for months, creating a durable food surplus, a bank of calories that guaranteed survival through the lean, dry months to come. And this reveals the ultimate touch of genius. When we look at this system, we realize they were not just clever hunters. They were farmers. They were practicing a form of aquaculture more sustainable than anything we have invented since. By creating this massive artificial wetland, they were not just trapping eels. They were vastly expanding their natural habitat. They created the perfect environment for the eels to thrive, to grow larger and more numerous than they would have in a purely natural system. They were cultivating their resource, and in their wisdom, they designed the system with gaps and overflows, ensuring that countless eels always escaped the traps, making their way to the ocean to breed, guaranteeing that the great cycle would continue. It was a system designed not for maximum extraction, but for eternal persistence. This was not a mine. It was a garden. The great machine worked. It was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering, a clockwork of stone and water that harvested the bounty of the land with unparalleled efficiency. But the true measure of its success is not found in the number of eels caught, but in the world that this abundance made possible. What then were the fruits of this land? What was the ultimate consequence of solving the ancient problem of boom and bust? The answer is simple, and it is profound. It changed everything. The first and greatest gift was predictability. The smoked eels, stored in the hollows of ancient trees, represented something more than mere food. They represented security. This was a bank of calories, a buffer against the whims of the unforgiving climate. For the first time, a long, dry season did not automatically mean a long, desperate hunger. This security was the currency that purchased the future. It bought them the single most valuable resource any society can possess, a surplus of time and collective energy. With this surplus, the Gunditjmara were freed from the relentless day-to-day search for subsistence, and this freedom untethered them from the iron law of nomadism that governed so many other peoples in arid environments. They no longer needed to constantly follow the resources, because they had brought the resources to them. They could stay. They could build. They could create a home. The most powerful evidence of this transformation lies scattered amongst the channels and weirs of Budge Bim, hiding in plain sight, the foundations of stone houses. These were not flimsy, temporary shelters. They were robust, semi-permanent dwellings with stone walls, likely topped with wood and sod roofs, clustered together in villages. We must pause to consider the weight of this. A village with permanent homes. This single fact is a revolution. It dismantles a centuries-old myth of a people destined to wander forever. It speaks of a society with a deep sense of place, of community, of permanence. It speaks of a people who return to the same hearth, night after night, generation after generation. These humble stone circles are their pyramids, symbols not of death and power, but of life and stability. This newfound permanence allowed their culture to blossom. With time to spare, human ingenuity flourishes. Artisans could now dedicate themselves to perfecting their craft. The stone axes of the region, quarried from specific sacred sites and traded over vast distances, became objects of incredible skill and beauty. Weaving evolved beyond purely functional baskets into more intricate patterns. And art, expressed on rock walls and in ceremony, could grow in complexity and meaning. Society itself became richer and more specialized. The elders and knowledge keepers, freed from the constant need to hunt, could devote their full attention to their true role, maintaining the vast, unwritten library of their people's wisdom. They were the judges, the historians, the scientists, and the spiritual leaders. A reliable surplus also meant wealth, and wealth fosters trade. The Gunditjmara's smoked eels were a valuable commodity. Archaeological evidence shows that materials like the greenstone for their finest axes traveled hundreds of kilometers to reach them. This was no isolated community. It was a vital hub in a complex network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that stretched across the continent. They were not just engineers, they were politicians and economists. Perhaps the greatest monument they built then was the system itself. Unlike the grand tombs and temples of other ancient cultures, which consumed vast resources to honor a single ruler or a distant god, their monument was alive. It was a productive ecological engine that fed everyone. Its power was not symbolic. It was tangible, felt in the full belly of a child and the security of the community. It was a monument not to a king, but to a collective, a testament to a society's ability to live in a sustainable partnership with its environment. The fruit of their land, therefore, was far more than just food. It was stability. It was community. It was art, trade, and the time to deepen their spiritual connection to the world around them. Their great machine did not just re-engineer the landscape, it re-engineered their society, allowing them to create a rich, complex, and enduring civilization that has, until now, remained almost entirely invisible to the outside world. For over 6 millennia, the great machine of Budge Bim endured. It survived droughts that would have shattered lesser societies. It weathered floods that reshaped the very landscape. Its longevity is a testament to its resilience, a near-perfect harmony of human ingenuity and natural design. It is tempting, then, to view this world as a utopia, a timeless, unchanging paradise. But no system, whether natural or man-made, is without its fragilities. No design is entirely immune to the pressures of time and chance. So what was the other side of the coin? What was the Achilles heel of this ancient and brilliant society? The first vulnerability was woven into its very design. The entire system was a masterful strategy to manage Australia's boom and bust water cycle, but it was still fundamentally dependent upon it. It could brilliantly mitigate a drought, holding on to water for months or even years, but it could not survive a truly catastrophic one, a mega drought lasting for decades, of the kind that paleoclimatology tells us is possible. The machine could not create water from a mercilessly empty sky. It was built to ride the waves of climatic variability, but a great enough tsunami of drought could still, in theory, overwhelm it. An even greater fragility, however, lay not in the stones but in the minds of its keepers. The system's operating manual was not carved into stone tablets or written on papyrus. It was a living library, stored in the memories of the elders and transmitted through the fragile chain of oral tradition. The songs, the stories, the ceremonies, these were the software that ran the entire machine. And like any living library, it was mortal. The loss of a key elder to accident or illness was the equivalent of a foundational textbook being burned. The loss of a generation of knowledge keepers would be a cataclysm, leaving behind a silent, inscrutable collection of stones, whose purpose could no longer be fully understood. The system's greatest strength, its basis in deep human knowledge, was also its most profound vulnerability. For thousands of years, they managed these risks. They navigated the climate, and they successfully passed their knowledge across more than 200 generations. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a new threat appeared on the horizon. It was a threat that fell entirely outside their vast library of experience. It was a force for which their stories and their ancestors had no precedent. It was a cataclysm that would prove to be the system's breaking point. The arrival of Europeans was not a meeting of cultures. It was a collision of realities. And it unleashed a series of devastating waves that the Gunditjmara and their great machine could not withstand. The first wave was invisible and silent. Introduced diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which the people had no immunity, swept through the continent, often far in advance of the settlers themselves. The plagues tore through communities, killing up to 90% of the population in some areas. Crucially, they struck down the old and the young alike. With the death of the elders, entire libraries of knowledge vanished in a single season. The software was becoming corrupted. The chain of transmission was being brutally severed. The second wave was one of conquest and displacement. The British colonists arrived with a worldview that was utterly incompatible with the one that had sustained the land for millennia. They brought the concept of terra nullius, the legal fiction that the land was empty, that it belonged to no one. They could not see the aquaculture system for what it was. They saw only a worthless swamp. They could not see the managed grasslands as a form of farming. They saw only untamed wilderness. And so they laid claim to it, introducing their hard-hooved sheep and cattle, whose grazing compacted the earth and destroyed the native yams. The Gunditjmara were driven from their ancestral lands, violently removed from the machine they had operated for 6,000 years. They were unplugged from their own creation. The final wave was the physical destruction. To make way for pasture, the new arrivals began to systematically dismantle the machine itself. They drained the precious wetlands, altering the hydrology forever. They pulled apart the stone weirs and channels, the very bones of the system, to build fences and foundations for their own homes. The system did not fail. It was not abandoned. It was murdered. It had survived 6,500 years of nature's worst, only to be broken in less than a century by a people who were utterly blind to the miracle they were destroying. Its ultimate fragility was not in its design, but in its profound and tragic incompatibility with a worldview that could not even recognize its existence. For more than a century after its destruction, a great silence fell over the landscape. The carefully engineered channels choked with silt. The stone walls were swallowed by grass and earth. In the official, written history of a new nation, this entire chapter of human achievement was rendered invisible, relegated to the footnotes of a colonial story. The great machine was gone, and the world had seemingly forgotten it ever existed. But it was not forgotten by the descendants of its makers. The knowledge was driven underground, held in trust by the Gunditjmara people who had been torn from their homes, but never from their identity. For generations, the story was kept alive, a glowing ember in the ashes of a devastating fire. To truly grasp the tragedy of this loss and the miracle of its return, we must first comprehend the sheer scale of its persistence. This system of aquaculture was in operation for at least 6,600 years. Let that number sink in. While the first stones were being laid for the pyramids in Egypt, the Gunditjmara were harvesting eels. While the Roman Empire rose, conquered half the known world and crumbled into dust, the Gunditjmara were harvesting eels. While the great cathedrals of medieval Europe reached for the heavens, the Gunditjmara were maintaining their channels, reading the seasons and harvesting eels. This single, continuous operation lasted for more than 300 human generations. Our entire industrial age, by comparison, is barely 8 generations old, and already it is showing catastrophic signs of unsustainability. The machine at Budge Bim was not a fleeting experiment. It was arguably one of the most stable and successful examples of human civilization on record. And the story did not end in ruin. In the late 20th century, the embers began to glow once more. Led by their elders, the Gunditjmara people began a long, arduous fight to have their history recognized and their land returned. They used the colonizers' own tools, the courts, the archives, and archaeology, to prove what their oral traditions had always known. They pieced together the evidence, mapped the ancient systems, and demanded that the world finally see the truth that was written in the stones. And in 2019, the world finally saw. In a moment of profound historical justice, the Budge Bim cultural landscape was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It was recognized not as a static relic, but as a living, breathing cultural landscape, a masterpiece of human creative genius. Today, the Gunditjmara are once again the custodians of their country. They are actively working to restore the ancient water flows, blending the deep knowledge of their ancestors with modern science. They are healing the land, and in doing so, they are healing their own community. The machine is slowly being brought back to life. This is the echo in time. This ancient story from the other side of the world matters to every single one of us today, as we stand at our own precarious crossroads. It forces us to ask fundamental questions. What is technology? The story of Budge Bim suggests that the most sophisticated technology is not always a complex machine of metal and circuits, but perhaps a deep, symbiotic knowledge of a living system. It redefines sustainability, showing us a model based not on domination and extraction, but on partnership and reciprocity. It is a powerful, undeniable argument that the indigenous knowledge systems of the world are not primitive superstitions. They are some of the most advanced and resilient sciences our species has ever produced. The stones of Budge Bim are more than a ruin. They are a classroom for the 21st century. They teach us that another way of living is, and always has been, possible. They are a whisper from our deep past, offering a sliver of hope for our uncertain future. The forgotten wisdom of our ancestors is all around us, waiting to be rediscovered. These are the stories of how we solved impossible problems long before the age of the machine. If you wish to continue this journey and uncover more of this lost ingenuity, please subscribe to our channel and join us as we continue to explore the world that was.